A quick recap of one of our previous lectures introduced that the three main themes of early photography was the use of photography as a factual document, in other words, using photography to support science. Another was photographs as a historical witness, the chronicle of human activities and events. And another yet was to elevate photography as art. In the decade after photography was introduced, most photographers and the public were fascinated by the verisimilitude or believability of photographic images. While some photographic artists were concerned with formal composition from the start, these explorations were generally held within the application of photographs as factual documents. Others from this period, like Gustave and Nadar, were still using the camera to record facts, but were equally interested in the artistic qualities of their images. They were interested in conveying emotion as well as fact. Nadar especially was interested in photography's acceptance as art. While not unconcerned with the photograph as factual document, other photographers tended towards using photography as artifice, meaning clever deception. Their works tend towards narration, and they were early proponents of photography's acceptance as art. Like Legray and Nadar, these British artists drew inspiration from painting, drawing, literature, and theater. Of their works, one 19th century critic lamented, quote, "Photography tried to be judged as painting, while painting judged as photography." Thus the debate began, is photography art? I should mention when I was a student of photography in the 1970s, that debate was still raging. To provide some original context for these images we're going to look at today, this was still the Victorian period, essentially that period 1837 to 1901, which often pitted the emerging use of science versus religious beliefs. It was also the waning period of Romanticism, which favored the common person and sentimentality in their work. Though naturalism was taking its hold, naturalism refers to a view that natural laws and forces operate the universe, not necessarily humankind. William Lake Price, an architectural and topographical artist by training, Price was an innovator in the field of mid-19th century photography. He helped revolutionize the combination printing technique and frequently exhibited his paintings and watercolors at the Royal Academy and the Old Watercolor Society before taking up photography in 1854. He specialized in genre paintings. Genre paintings are scenes of everyday life or domestic scenes. Despite his success as a genre painter, Price began to pursue his interest in photography in the mid-1850s and joined the London Photographic Society and the Photographic Exchange Club of London. He became active in the field during a key period in the evolution of British photography, a relatively new science, also expanding phenomena of the artist/photographer. His first photographs were primarily genre scenes, one of which appeared in the Society's Photographic Album of the Year in 1855. He also photographed historical and literary scenes as well as numerous portraits, which were published in an ambitious 1858 collection entitled Portraits of Eminent British Artists. A few examples which you will see here. Also in 1858, he published the Manual of Photographic Manipulation, a practical, instructional work most likely intended for the amateur photographer. He used the collodion process, and again, combination printing. Price's photographic works were well received by the public, and he soon became a chief proponent of that combination printing technique. He also experimented, as you saw earlier, with stereoscopic pictures. Henri Peach Robinson studied painting and drawing, his artwork often taking its inspiration and subject matter from the traditions in these fields, as well as from literature. In 1857, Robinson abandoned the book-selling trade and opened a photographic studio specializing in portraits. Robinson learned combination printing from his friend Oscar Gustav Rylander, who we'll look at next, a technique we also saw in Gustave Le Gray and championed by William Lake Price, where multiple negatives are used to create a single image. With the popularity of his image fading away, Henri Peach Robinson became a household name in Britain. You can see in this piece, technically, where he's made this image from several different negatives. Each one of these people were photographed separately and then essentially collaged together to create this moving piece. The title here is evocative as well, Fading Away. As you look at the narrative of this piece, and most of these artists used narratives. They used their pictures to tell stories. If you look at the narrative, you see what's probably a mother or perhaps a grandmother looking at the younger child who's lying. The implication is that she's dying. You can see her mother or sister looking over her, her father looking forlorn out the window, and you can even see the cloud is made to look like perhaps it's a spirit as the life is leaving the body. Again, this is likely one negative. This is a separate negative. That's a third negative. And my guess is this is a fourth negative and the background's a fifth negative. That's a bit of a guess, but it's an educated guess. Earlier piece that I showed you was done as a study for this piece. As you can see, it's likely the same girl in the same bed, same clothing, etc. In the early 1850s, Robinson tended towards architectural and landscape studies. In the late 1850s and 1860s, he specialized in these narrative genre images, as well as his composite prints. In 1891, Robinson and several others formed the Link Ring, a society of photographers who had grown disillusioned by the photograph establishments as represented by the Photographic Society of London. The Link Ring, also known as the Brotherhood of the Link Ring, was a photographic society created to prose and defend that photography was just as much an art as it was a science, motivated to propelling photography further into the fine art world. Members dedicated to the craft looked for new techniques that persuaded photographers and enthusiasts to experiment with chemical processes, printing techniques, and new styles. The group was founded in May by Henri Peach Robinson, George Davidson, and Henry Vanderwade. Membership of the group was by invitation only, and while there were many members, some of these included photographers Frank Meadow Sutcliffe, Frederick Evans, Alvin Langdon Coburn, and James Craig Annan. Later, Americans Alfred Stieglitz and Clarence White of note were invited to the Brotherhood of the Link Ring. And while works by female photographers were exhibited at their annual exhibitions during the 1890s, it was not until 1900 that American Gertrude Kaiserbeer became the first elected female member of the Link Ring. We'll talk more about a few of these artists at a later lecture. We'll also be hearing more about the Link Ring. Robinson's crusade for art photographs found followers in France, Austria, and the United States. He became the standard bearer for British fine art photography in the latter half of the 19th century. He was not interested in overemphasizing the techniques of photography. He wrote, quote, "We want to apply these discoveries in higher purposes than we have hitherto done," High art is art with a moral purpose. He was passionate about combination printing and really composed his images much like a painter would compose theirs. You can see in this finished piece, again, made up of multiple negatives. Generally, each setting of the different people here are photographed separately and then pieced together. Luckily, we have some examples that can show you how he built his pieces. While the finished version's a little bit different than this, you can see as he was working on it. Let me go back and forth a little bit. So you can see the figure in the foreground here change, but some of these other figures are the same. And so even the backgrounds where you see in this image where he's painted those in looks like watercolor to me, just to give himself an idea of how to compose these images. So it's a study for the holiday in the wood, as you see here, and hence the finished piece. Some other examples. So here you can see a sketch with one of the posed photographic figures tipped into the composition, while the others are still sketched. Or his finished work, Bringing Home the May from 1862. And here you can see, again, a pair of people posing and how he would essentially cut out parts of the photograph and collage them together. Another example. Robinson was passionate about photography. He stated, quote, "It was soon evident in my lodgings that I had become a dangerous lunatic, and there would be nothing left to destroy if strong measures were not taken. So I turned out of the house, but it was only into the garden where I was allowed to build a small darkroom of oilcloth." End of quote. Like many early photographers, Robinson had to give up darkroom work at the young age of 34 because of a nervous condition brought on by exposure to the toxic photographic chemicals. Robinson continued, however, his active involvement in photography. He wrote the influential book Pictorial Effect in Photography, being Hints on Composition and Chiaroscuro for Photographers, which was first published in 1868. From the preface he wrote, quote, "One of the greatest difficulties in writing a book for beginners in any art is to make it simple enough. 9 out of 10 photographers are, unfortunately, quite ignorant of art. Comparatively few have regarded the science as a means of giving pictorial embodiment to their ideas. It is denied by some that art and photography can be combined. They ridicule the idea that a knowledge of the principles of art can be of use to the photographer. It is to counteract these erroneous notions that I've insisted so strongly on understanding these guiding laws." End of quote. One Robinson critic wrote, quote, "He has at least endeavored to do something more than portray facts. He has always displayed intention and left something for imagination. He has, in short, aimed at art." End of quote. In this rather fanciful piece, you can see Robinson, in addition to using the traditions and subject matter of genre paintings, of turning towards literature as he's illustrated Little Red Riding Hood. Robinson's belief that the commonplace provided the richest subject matter is typical of a romantic view of the world. And in this piece, again, I have a good example of how he put these together, where you can see again that he completely sketches it out and then goes out and make photographs to conform to his sketch. Curator Roy Flukinger writes, quote, "To view Robinson's work today is to see it with eyes and hearts and minds transformed by nearly a century's worth of newer technical innovations, attitudes, and human experience. In permitting ourselves to be blinded by the theatricality of his compositions or the overt prosaicness of their themes, we forget that no photographer came closer to achieving both the artistic scale and the aesthetic attitudes of the many painters and printmakers of this time. Of his country pictures, a reviewer wrote, quote, "Mr. Robinson avoids all appearance of trick and all theatrical effect by never troubling the costume or dressing his figures. They are presented in the homely garb of actual life, which seems to benefit them as naturally as the leaves belong to trees." Again, he was well known during his time, was the champion of art photography in the latter half of the 19th century, particularly in England, but in Europe in general. He was a prolific writer. He offered essays on photography in most English journals and was a household name. He eventually, in 1901, succumbed to the poisonous effects of photographic chemicals and died. Born in Sweden, like Robinson and Price, Oscar Gustave Rylander was trained in the visual arts. He was first a painter and then lithographer. He worked in Rome as a portrait painter and a copyist. He took up photography around 1851. His works, too, are often influenced by the traditional arts, the visual arts, and literature. He moved to London in 1862, and with Price and Robinson was part of a controversial and theatrical photography movement that emerged in Britain in the period of the 1850s and 1860s. He aimed to fulfill the higher purposes implicit in ideal beauty, quote, "not merely to amuse, but to instruct, to purify, to ennoble," end of quote, the photographer wrote in 1860. His work is an attempt at high art. Again, high art being art with a moral purpose. You can see a couple examples here of his piece, The Hard Times. Again, he's interested in employed combination printing. Likely the guy in the foreground. There's a separate negative from the people in the background. Here you can see where he's actually sandwiching negatives together, so having two or more things occupy the same space by simply overlapping. So you can kind of see the daughter and mother and the forlorn father may be afraid that he can't support his family. And then you can see almost like a ghost-like image of him emerging, as well as that of his wife. Like Robinson, Rylander tends to use narrative, to use photographs that tell a story. Sometimes you can see those things, the narrative implied in the title, "I Pays." As you look again, you have a couple of guys out drinking probably beer, a woman who's there to serve them, and they're arguing over who gets to pay for each other. They also fulfilled the interest in genre painting or genre scenes, scenes of everyday, common occurrences in everyday people. This is a study, part of what became his most famous piece, The Two Ways of Life. Again, with his combination printing techniques, which he taught to Robinson. The women here are photographed separately than the people here or the men over here, so using multiple negatives. He was influenced by Raphael and 16th century High Renaissance. Indeed, he was tried consistently, consciously, to elevate photography to art. His most famous piece that you see here, Two Ways of Life, was modeled after Theodore Couture's Les Rameaux de la Décadence, painted in 1847. I'm going to come back to Rylander's image. This is essentially a story, if you can see here, you've got a central figure that divides the left and the right side. They are essentially the two ways of life. And if you can see, there's a man on either side, and you can even see he's got his hand up to his ear. So he's listening to the one side and he's aiming towards the other side. This figure would represent those two ways of life that you can go towards: studious, pious, hardworking people, working to learn a trade, studying the Bible, and those kinds of things, or leaning towards drinking and decadence, as that you see with the figures there. Again, it's high art. It's art intended to make a moral statement and a moral purpose. The Two Ways of Life was created from 30 separate negatives and took 6 weeks to create. At least 4 copies were made. It was a controversial piece during its time. Critics really didn't love this work or this style of work, but the public did. The royal family bought a copy of Two Ways of Life. But here's an example of one critic's view. Two Ways of Life, which was written in the Art Journal in 1858. The pose of each figure is good, and the grouping of the whole as nearly as perfect as possible. We do not, however, desire to see many advances in this direction. Works of high art are not to be executed by a mechanical trivance. The hand of man, guided by the heaven-born mind, can alone achieve greatness in this direction. In other words, to this critic, these kinds of things should only be painted, not photographed. Again, his works tends toward narration, and you can see a lot of the intent in his titles. You see the title Dream and a man asleep, and in the foreground we have figures climbing and falling, and the different things those dreams might mean. Again, I should point out in some of these illustrations, these were likely photographed with a sheet of glass, and so some of these things that you see here are probably the glass holding the piece flat or protecting the piece, but we're getting some reflections in these images. But again, the title, Caught, creates the narrative along with the picture. The picture illustrates the concept in the title. If you see what's going on in the picture, you see a boy trying to unlock a locked box and a woman who's peeked around the curtain and caught the boy in his actions, or a secret. And if you look here, you can see the boy in the middle, a girl leaning over, whispering in one ear, while the other one seems to be leaning towards him to try to learn that secret. Or grief in the theatrical pose to express that emotion. Homeless, the boy looks despaired, and again, the emotion portrayed by gesture and the garb. If you'll notice, his pants are torn, his shirt is dirty and torn, he's barefoot. All of those things are leading the viewer to express or to feel the expression of the emotion. These are sentimental and typical of genre studies, and certainly they're theatrical or theatrical portraits. Again, newsboy crying the news of the Chicago fire. Again, the newsboy barefoot with dirty clothes, trying to make a few cents here and there selling newspapers. This is a piece by a contemporary photographer. I just thought I'd throw this in. We'll talk more about Jerry Oldman later in the semester, somebody I know and admire. This was his self-portrait that he did in 1964. The idea and the use of combination printing by the end of the century had largely died out, though there have always been some photographers that practiced it. But it really, in the first half of the 20th century, was not a terribly popular approach to photography. But indeed, Jerry Oldman, whose work came out in the late 1950s and throughout the 60s, and he's still alive and working today, started re-employing the technique of combination printing. Hence his portrait self-portrait as Robinson and Rylander, essentially the two practitioners, most famous practitioners in the 19th century of combination printing. He's sort of making the comment that these are like two peas in a pod. They're the two people in the same bathtub doing the same kinds of techniques with similar kinds of ideas and narratives. It's done tongue-in-cheek, but also as an homage to these two earlier artists. In 1872, Rylander started to illustrate Charles Darwin's book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals. Again, these are theatrically posed photographs. Sometimes he's using himself, sometimes he's using other sitters, but he's trying to create photographic illustrations that express human emotion, where this one might express pain. Or here you can see on the left fear, or the woman on the right sneering in defiance. Looking at photography and the truthfulness of photography to create settings or scenes that employ human emotion. Well, indeed, because photographs are believable, we might tend to believe these images, even though they are certainly actors acting these emotions rather than portraying the actual emotion. One of the great photographers of the 19th century was Julia Margaret Cameron. Her work is still influential today. She was born in Calcutta and educated in France. In 1863, when Cameron was 48 years old, her daughter gave her a camera as a present, thereby starting her career as a photographer. Within a year, Cameron became a member of the photographic societies in both London and Scotland. Cameron and those in her circle were interested in blending traditional artistic content, beauty, and religion with modern forms of expression. Theology, Christian art, and poetic consciousness were her subjects. She was interested and believed in the Greek idea of the muse, which provided stimulus and inspiration for creativity. English painter George Frederick Watts was her friend and mentor. Here you see one of his paintings. Her works were often religious allegories, portraits of her friends and family, and illustrations pulled from literature and poetry. Cameron did all of her own photography and printing. She pulled most of her allegories from either the Bible or from Shakespeare. For her, individual representation of the person was not enough. A photograph had to achieve a degree of idealization to carry it above the studio portrait. In her photography, Cameron strove to capture beauty. She wrote, "I long to arrest all the beauty that came before me, and at length the longing has been satisfied." End of quote. Alfred Lord Tennyson, her neighbor on the Isle of Wight, often brought friends to see the photographer, many of whom sat for her camera. Sharp focus imagery was less useful for her as she sought the spiritual meaning rather than the factual representation of her subjects. Excessive detail would simply get in the way. Portrait of her niece, Julia Jackson, seen in another picture here. This great portrait of Alice Liddell. If that name rings a bell, this is Alice from Alice in Wonderland. I should mention Lewis Carroll also was a photographer of note during this period. He also photographed Alice Liddell. I've eliminated Carroll from this lecture simply because some of his photographs, frankly, are a little bit creepy. He mostly photographed young women, young girls. Some of them would not have met the standards for YouTube. She was also inspired and a part of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, a group of English painters, poets, and critics founded in 1848. The group's intention was to reform art by rejecting what they considered to be the mechanistic approach first adopted by the Mannerist artists who succeeded Raphael and Michelangelo. They believed that the classical poses and elegant compositions of Raphael in particular had been a corrupting influence on the academic teaching of art, hence the name Pre-Raphaelites, meaning before Raphael, a example of English mannerism. Cameron was also involved with the theory of high art, that is, art with a moral purpose. The Madonna in Child is one of her common themes. You'll see that in the next few photographs. Madonna in Child here, from Renaissance-era paintings. So again, like some of the others that we've looked at today, looking towards traditional forms of art as both inspiration and a way also to use this new medium in ways that would be accepted as art, as their subjects were traditional to art. You can see both the religious and the literary allegories in a few of these photographs. Cameron was sometimes obsessive about her new occupation, with subjects sitting for countless exposures in the blinding light, as she laboriously coated, exposed, and processed each wet plate. Her exposures were often between 3 and 7 minutes. The results were in fact unconventional in their intimacy and their particular visual habit of creating blur through long exposures where the subject moved and by leaving the lens intentionally out of focus. This led to some of her contemporaries to complain and even ridicule her work, but her friends and family were supportive, and she was one of the most prolific and advanced photographers of her time. Her enthusiasm for her craft meant that her children and sometimes others tired of her endless photographing, but it also means that they were left with some of the best records of her children and of the many notable figures of the time who visited her. Her aim was rich meaning, not flawless technique. Her work met with mixed critical reviews during her life. One critic wrote her work was, quote, admirably expressive and vigorous, but dreadfully opposed to photographic conventionalities and properties. Eventually, her family was broke, and in 1875 they returned to India as it was cheaper to live, cutting short her artistic career. By the mid-19th century, Britain was one of the first period of great popular appreciation for supportive art. The opening of the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery occurred just before Cameron started to photograph. In Cameron's work, we see the poetry of everyday objects, events, and people. In 1829, Cardinal Newman wrote a piece called Poetry, which said, quote, with Christians, a poetical view of things is a duty. We are to bid to color all things with the hues of faith. Cameron regarded her photographs as manifestations of God in terms of living persons. Victorian times in which she lived saw people much more active in religion than in modern times. With the advances in science, and particularly Darwinism, there was a growing conflict between religion and science. This, to an extent, forced people to extremes in the belief of God or in the belief of science.